So we have a little shift in our program. Jean-Luc will start this session with his paper, and I have the pleasure now to present you. First of all, let me express my appreciation that you are now available to present at our conference despite the very unpleasant turbulences yesterday at the airport without even boarding the plane. So it's really a pity, but yes, good to have you here now. Luc Enyegue is from Cameroon, but as a member of the Society of Jesus, he lived and studied and worked in various places internationally. He did his novitiate in Rwanda, pursued studies in philosophy in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and studies in theology at the Universidad Pontificia Comillas in Madrid. At Boston College in the United States, he earned a licentiate in theology and a PhD in church history and hermeneutics. The dissertation examining the role of the Jesuits in colonial and post-colonial West Africa indicates already why he fits very well into the program of this conference. I also brought your dissertation, your book along. So Competing Catholicisms, the Jesuits, the Vatican, and the Making of Post-Colonial French Africa. Since 2020, he has served as director of the Jesuit Historical Institute in Africa in Nairobi. That's the central research and archival center for Jesuit history on the continent. And he teaches church history at Hekima University College. Recently only, there is some news about you, Jean-Luc. In October, he was appointed the new provincial of the West Africa province, beginning his term in January 2026. I'm not sure whether I should congratulate for this new move in your career, because I wonder, because your excellent academic contribution, how will that develop during this new task? Okay. Father Enyegue's research focuses on the history of the Catholic Church and the Society of Jesus in Africa, especially in Cameroon and Chad. His work explores how Jesuit missionary activity, colonial power structures, and African contexts intersected, and how African Christians in the 20th century forged their own ecclesial identity within these dynamics. His book, I already presented, Competing Catholicism, is regarded as a landmark study on the relationship between mission, colonialism, and ecclesiology in the French-speaking Church of Africa. In addition, he is deeply engaged in the preservation and development of African archival resources and in mentoring young scholars of African church history. Once again, we are very happy to have you here, and we are looking forward to your presentation. Jean-Luc.
Thank you very much, Marcus, for the generous presentation. And I wish I was there with you, but all works well for those who love Jesus. So after I canceled my German visa yesterday morning, I end up getting another one that's why I was not connected yesterday. So I finally got a visa yesterday, but it was late to travel. And that visa is even very long. It is 5 years. So at the end of the day, things worked very well. So ladies and gentlemen, all protocol observed, I was supposed to present on intercultural postcolonial inquiries into universalism. from an African perspective. As I was reflecting on that important topic, I found it simpler to basically focus on one particular African author and one article of his, because that particular article addresses post-colonialism, it addresses post-Vatican II, and it focuses on mission, knowing that we cannot address mission in Africa without Nostra aetate. So I shared my PowerPoint with Robin. He can share it with you as well. So the title of my presentation this morning is Ebussi Bulaga's Démission, 60 years after Gentes and Nostra aetate. So the author is Ebussi Bulaga. Who is he? Ebussi, he is one of the first Cameroonian Jesuits. His father was a catechist, and the catechist was basically the job description for Cameroonian evangelizers until the 1940s. In 1935, he was born around the time when we are having the first Cameroonian priest ordained in the context of the indigenization of Catholic clerical personnel and leadership in Africa. He did the minor seminary on the Holy Ghost Fathers, and then in 1955, he joined the Jesuits and did his theology in Lyon-Fourvière, living in the same community with great theologians like Henri de Lubac, whose role in the council is very well known. Ebussi was ordained priest in 67, just 2 years after the council, and he got a doctorate in philosophy, returned to Cameroon to work in a high school and then as a teacher in the major seminary of Yaoundé, where he also became head of studies. And in that position, he attempted to Africanize the curriculum. And during that same period, he started publishing articles with Concilium, feeling that the church needed reforms and that the reforms that were proposed during Vatican II were not bold enough, because to him, this reform did not really address the deep challenges the church was facing. He will struggle with that issue until the 1980s, when he finally even left the Jesuit and left priesthood and secularized. So that Ebussi Bulaga is a very influential theologian. We have many Africans, so he was very influential. We have a number of books and theses that has been written on him. So in 1974, he published an interesting article in Spiritus journal, and the title of the article is La Démission. And La Démission is a French word composed. We have de and mission. So it is basically on demissionization of the church in Africa. So in the introduction of that book, Ebussi provides the context in which he is writing this article. He says that he was reacting to the last push by Rome in 1957 to send additional Fidei Donum missionaries, lay volunteers and nuns to Africa. And that he was shocked to realize that these newcomers, for these newcomers, Africa was like a fertile land, ripe for what they learned from their missiology classes in Europe. Ebussi is reacting to an article that was written in 57, and he's doing so in 1974. We can ask why. Because in 57, he was simply a novice. and the Jesuit novices are not supposed to be writing strongly on what the Pope is saying. And it is also because the context, immediate context of the 1970s saw the rise of cultural revolutions across Africa in countries like Sudan, Uganda, Chad, and especially Zaire. And these cultural revolutions, political in nature, also affected the life of the church. And the third immediate context is that Pope Paul VI actually visited Uganda in 1969. And during that visit, he basically declared that Africans have to become their own missionaries. So if you take Fidei Donum, then you take the cultural revolutions of the 1970s, then you take this statement by Pope Paul VI in Uganda in 69, and then you add to it the context of the Synod on 1974, then you can understand the whole context of the article, La Mission. So in the article, Ebusi will develop two main theses. The first thesis is that the missionary action of the last few years in Africa has operated as if the Western world, which was then in a religious crisis, was running away from that crisis. And second, mission in modern times was structurally a colonization, and therefore it was a violent system that could only end with a violent process. Ebusi then, therefore, if the mission is violent, if Africans have to become their own missionaries, as Pope Paul VI had suggested in Africa Terrarum in 1967 and in Kampala in 1969, then those words that Africans should become their own missionaries should first be addressed to the West. Western Christianity, in its contradiction and its current failures back home, did not deserve to be exported. Because mission was colonialism, violent in nature, such a system could not be reformed. It continued to produce local churches totally dependent on Western missionaries and volunteers and their financial support. And these were an impediment to effective Africanization. What to do? We are at slide 10 for those who are presenting. So what to do? That's the very last sentence of the article. The answer will be brief. Let Europe and America evangelize themselves first and plan the orderly departure of missionaries from Africa. That's basically the content of that article. And I am using it because the reaction to this article were really spread across Africa. I start proposing you one article by Charles Van Damme, who was a Buddhist provincial at the time. So they had a province assembly gathering all Jesuit discourse about the matters of the province in 76. And the article was highly debated with a lot of frustration running through the room. And the provincial had this to say, there is a feeling that this is probably the first and the last generation of European missionaries in the province. And this is the West African province. And then we have another article by another Jesuit who became bishop, Isidore de Souza, who says there is a changing world in which former mission territories will become missionaries providers. And among the challenges facing the new churches were the structures they inherited from the West, their cost, and their sustainability. The moratorium that Ebusi basically is reflecting in Mission has been going on among Protestant churches. And therefore, de Souza believed that that moratorium in the Catholic Church was actually hasty and it has to be slowed down. Jesuit Jules Dubois from Congo observed that some missionaries wanted to maintain the status quo at any cost. Others were withdrawing from long-term planning, paralyzed by the uncertainty about their future. And yet others were simply creating oases, no man's land ministries, where they will allow non-African supervision. And then Dubois writes, he's a Belgian, the colonial era is well done when Europeans were all powerful and controlled the economy, the politics, the human and spiritual training of the clergy. Africanization has become an unquestionable principle today. Rodrigo Mejia, who also later became a bishop, was the rector of the Jesuit philosophy in Kimwenza in Congo, where most African Jesuits were being trained in philosophical studies. And in one of his homilies, he used the word démissionnaire in an echo to Eboussi's démission. And in that homily, he called out missionaries who were resigning or withdrawing from apostolic commitment. He also departed a little bit from what he considered Eboussi idealism and the idealism of other moratorium proponents. Instead, he advocated to take a more realistic approach to mission. And the realistic approach he was referring to was the one adopted by the 44th International and Ecumenical Missiological Week of Namur in Belgium in 1974. And that approach basically was advocating for the missionaries and the new African rising elite in the church to work in a more collaborative way. And that voice is basically reflected in the position adopted by African bishops who address the missionary directly through letters and speeches, homilies, all kind of stuff. So the bishop acknowledged the historical role the missionaries had played in building the African church. They also remain realistic in the appreciation of the context in which they were living, echoing Pope Pius XII and the current changes in the Catholic Church. Some went further by defining the new role of Western missionaries as collaborateurs avertis, which means informed collaborators. And these informed collaborators were to, I quote, assimilate and integrate the reality of a particular church in which they were serving. Missionaries, therefore, had to Africanize in order to continue their work in Africa. Patrick Kalilombe, a bishop from Malawi, will say a certain kind of mission, the mission as we knew it, was révolu. It was a bygone era. So these are like immediate reactions among African Catholics to the mission. But when you analyze that article in the broader context of African Christianity, so beyond Catholicism, what you realize is that the mission is in fact a Catholic version of the Protestant moratorium. In my own research, I realized that in fact, following the speech of Pope Paul VI in 1969, there was already some malaise among missionaries. Jesuit father Eric de Rony, who is very well known, he wrote an article in Études in 1970. And in that article, the title is Mission terminée, in French, ? Mission terminated. So in that article, he is discussing about his personal crisis. And that crisis was born as he was listening to Pope Paul VI's declaration in Kampala. And he started wondering himself whether, as a French missionary, he could even return to Africa to serve there as a missionary. He then wrote to his superior in Cameroon at the time, who was newly appointed, a Cameroonian who is also a scholar, Menrad Hebga, asking him what to do. And Hebga did not respond, which was interpreted by de Rony that de Rony was the one to find the right answer to the crisis he was going through. Finally, he will decide to come back to Cameroon. And when he comes back to Cameroon, he will basically initiate a kind of conversion. He will be initiated to a local Sawa secret society of which he will become part of the nobility of that secret society. So which means that he decided to become an African, getting African initiation, becoming a member of a traditional African religiosity so that he can become a more effective missionary. These are important things because they are happening immediately after Vatican II and in the context of the Synod of 1974. And by the way, De Rosny later became provincial, which means that even the kind of Christianity he embodied by becoming an initiate, that kind of Christianity was even assumed by the church itself, and he is still celebrated today. We have a similar article by Marcel Boivin in 72, Missionaries Go Home, which was an illustration of that same sentiment, and it was also a global movement. And one of the African leaders of that movement, Moratorium, was a Kenyan Presbyterian known as John Gatu, who himself said that his inspiration was from Latin America, where at one point the Western missionaries were sent there in great number with the idea of re-evangelizing or advancing evangelization in that continent. But they realized that this great number of missionaries were actually killing local initiative, and therefore he used that Catholic failed experiment to actually promote moratorium among Protestant churches that ultimately led to all kind of schism within Protestant churches in Africa. So basically the moratorium was a broad movement among Protestant churches in Africa, and those churches will meet with Catholic scholars in the All African Conference of Churches in Africa, and we know that Gatu participated in that conference in Lusaka in 1974, and that Ebusi Bulaga was very aware of their discussions because some of them were published in a number of journals, Jesuit journals in Africa. So when we look at this document of the All African Churches, what are they saying? They are saying that Africanization has become a priority for the church in Africa. And that Africanization meant that the church in Africa, to become mature, was to be financially independent and to have an African leadership. And then that All African Council of Churches also concluded that the continuous presence of missionaries was becoming a hindrance to the emancipation of the church in Africa, and that ecclesiastical jurisdictions were shaped from outside and were still manipulated by Western influence and following colonial lines. So basically, this is the spirit of what was happening immediately after the publication of Gentes. It is as if basically the new push, the missionary activity of the church following Vatican II was perceived by these leading scholars and ecclesiastics as something that was not necessarily positive for Africa. So I want to spend a few times to just see how that how we can understand this demission today, and in light of the topic of this conference that we are having. So Ebusi's demission is actually a concrete case studies of African reception of Vatican II, especially at Gentes. We know that some scholars have considered the African contribution to the council, slide 18, if you are, okay, very good. Some scholars have considered the African contribution to the council as insignificant, and others in recent research have highlighted the prophetic contribution of African bishops in the council, including on matters related to Gentes and Aetate. So when you look at what Ebusi is proposing, beyond the financial dependence of African churches, his analysis actually helps us re-examine the material legacy of mission, its infrastructures, artifacts, even intellectual productions. Are we to keep them, to continue entertaining them, or do we need something totally different? His analysis and the reaction to his analysis also reveal a political turn in African missiologies following Vatican II. This tone was in conformity with clerical Africanization promoted by the Vatican since Maximum Eliot and Rerum Ecclesiae, etc. So by focusing on the Africanization of the church in terms of promoting an African leadership in the church, African missiology, and even the reception of the Vatican Council in Africa in certain cycles became highly political. And I think by becoming highly political or too much focus on clerical Africanization led to sidelining spiritual concerns that dominated the lived religion of many Christians in Africa. It also unfortunately marginalized discussions related to interreligious dialogue, which for some African bishops was a major issue during the council, and it remains a major issue for us today. Because you cannot imagine being Christian or Catholic in Africa without being in communion with other religions, including African traditional religions, including Islam and new forms of Christianities that are emerging. So during the council, African bishops held different positions as they addressed both gentes and aetate during the council. For example, the questions they were raising were what to do with the majority still following traditional religions in Africa during the council, what to do with those followers of Islam, and what to do with an often forgotten Jewish diaspora in Africa. Exactly at the time in the 1970s where there was a kind of political turn toward the Arab world, and that was often adversarial to Jesuit presence in Africa. So some of these bishops that reacted during the council was Archbishop Jean Zoa, who praised and advocated for Nostra aetate during the council, and then historian Jean-Paul Messina, who has studied him, believed that his enthusiasm was actually received cordially by the Roman Curia and even rejected by certain bishops like Monseigneur Marcel Lefebvre. And you may imagine why Marcel Lefebvre will be against Nostra aetate. And it is important to mention it here because Marcel Lefebvre was, if maybe the most powerful bishop in all of Francophone Africa by that time as Archbishop of Dakar and personal papal legate for Francophone Africa. We have another bishop in Northern Cameroon, Yves Plumet, and Northern Cameroon is interesting. Why? Because the church in Northern Cameroon is a small minority in a predominantly Muslim area. And Plumet had this to say: the declaration on Jews, Muslim, and other non-religions was imperative. Muslims number 400 million. They reject all fetishism and all superstition. They believe in one God, in Mary, and they venerate her. Therefore, Catholics should build bridges with Muslims and Jews in the African context. Basically, Plumet believed that a lack of dialogue would lead to conflict between religions and prevent the Catholic faith from flourishing, especially where it was a minority. And I think that this reality of the mission, where Christians were the minority religion, especially in the African context, was not fully appreciated by both gentes and Nostra aetate. So with such pluralism, Africa is naturally pluralistic as far as religion is concerned. Practical definitions of mission emerged during the council. At times, some bishops will promote implantatio in non-Christianized area where traditional religion still dominated. In other contexts, they will promote dialogue and collaboration, especially in Islam majority area. More importantly, they will really understand mission as ecumenism, especially in already Christianized area. And inculturation, the tendency is to connect inculturation as a bridge between Africans in their attempt to adapt or accommodate traditional religion. But in fact, inculturation is an intra-Catholic dialogue. It has to address how is it that a Catholic baptized Christian can still go to the Nganga and Marabu during the weekend when he or she is facing struggle in their lives. So ultimately, this analysis shows that the Christian mission, as outlined in Gentes, can only be carried in Africa through genuine dialogue. That is in line with the spirit of Nostra aetate. In light of Gentes and Nostra aetate, the mission of the church in post-colonial Africa remains an implantatio as far as it keeps establishing itself in places not formally Christianized, especially Islam and African traditional religions. But the mode of this implantation, that's where the change is. It is not about syncretism, it's not about conquest, it's about dialogue, presence, and collaboration. Assuming the Africanity of the church while upholding its universality with respect to other cultures, ideologies, and religious belief. So the mission of the church, therefore, in Africa, post-Vatican II, and as we are celebrating the 60th anniversary of Gentes and Nostra aetate, is basically, as Africa Munus described it in 2011, inculturation, ecumenism, and reconciliation. In the liminary space between Christianity and African traditional religions, we need inculturation. On the other hand, division within the Christian communion is described by African bishops even before the council as the most pressing challenge facing the church in its missionary activities in Africa. In fact, already in the 19th century, we have that conflict in the court of Buganda, in which the king is basically having Catholics and Protestants in his court, debating about who among them represent the true Christianity. And that situation will create double-mindedness, and it is actually more damaging to the mission in Africa than anything else that you can imagine. Therefore, mission is to be ecumenical, prioritary, but also to be focused on reconciliation within the Catholic communion itself. The third point I want to make is that we need what is called evangelisation en profondeur, in-depth evangelization. I think that in-depth evangelization was obscured due to the post-colonial debate and the political turn African missiologists took immediately after the Vatican Council because of too much focus on clerical and ecclesiastical Africanization. And I think that didn't help a lot because of that, Africans were not able to understand what it means to use what evangelicals and Pentecostals use here, it means to embrace Jesus Christ as their Redeemer and Savior, with all its consequences. And I think that's the challenge we are still facing today. So that inculturation process has to be dialogical. It has to be attentive to African cultures, value their richness, while simultaneously opening to the tradition and belief of others. And when I say others, beginning with the tradition of the church itself. And it has to create genuine encounter where faith and culture mutually enrich each other. Finally, we need to rediscover the true meaning of the mission in the African context today, beyond Ebusi and beyond those who oppose Ebusi. And I think we are still having that mentality today, especially among our young students. I am teaching a class in which I'm trying to convince my African students that mission was not colonialism, just to tell you where we are right now. And some of them are being prepared to become priests, and some of them are nuns and all of that. So it means that the debate is still ongoing, but we need to go deeper so that we can embrace a more spiritual and intellectual depth, and also fully appreciate the beauty of lived religion in Africa, because lived religion is actually both Christian, ecumenical, and pluralistic. In most of our families, we can have all these religions represented in that same family, and we eat together, and we go to one church to another, depending on days and events. So I want to finish with this beautiful quote and smile of Pope Francis. Smile, why? Because Pope Francis has had this to say about mission, that mission is primarily about attraction. Today, mission is about attraction. We need to live lives that attract others. And the key to attraction is the joy, the joy of the gospel that fills the hearts and lives of all who encounter Jesus. Those who accept his offer of salvation are set free from sin, sorrow, inner emptiness, and loneliness. With Christ, joy is constantly born anew. The root of such a joy, Francis believed, is the connection with the poor, which the majority of African Christians is, in truly journeying with them and learning from them their unique trust in God's providence. So that's basically what I prepared for you today, and I thank you for listening. I hope I didn't take too much time.
Asante sana, Jean-Luc. Thank you very much for this intriguing analysis of African contexts in various countries in post-colonial and post-Vatican developments. We have later time in a workshop. You will join us online in a workshop to deepen more the analysis and the aspects you brought up. So thank you very much. Right now, it was very exciting and very inspiring to ground our discussion. We started yesterday with a broad horizon, a wide vision of universality, and now we get into real context, and that is very inspiring. Thank you so much, and we continue with the next presentation. See you soon.
Thank you. See you.